We continue to look at topics related to the local government elections. Many gender rights activists say political parties aren't paying enough attention to issues facing women. Women make up the majority of the population, but little or no attention is given to them in the party's election manifestos. We discuss this now with gender rights activist Lisa Vetten. Good to have you in studio with us, Lisa.
Thanks, Joan.
I mean, we know the complaint during the 2011 election from many gender activists was that women had largely been ignored by political parties. Has anything changed in 2016?
No, not really, because I think if you look at the manifestos, they're either absent altogether. In the DA and EFF manifestos, for example, the words women and gender equality don't appear. The ANC has a couple of ideas, but the things they're doing right now, there's nothing new there at all. The IFP has some suggestions, but again, they're very vague. The interesting party was the UDM. They came up with some different ideas that one hasn't seen before, which, one would like to actually see what would happen if one put that into practice. But by and large, there was very little attention being paid to women and more of a focus on youth. But even when they focused on youth, there was no recognition of the fact that you have young men and young women. Unemployment is higher amongst young women than it is amongst young men. Young women face particular barriers around childcare, pregnancy. Their educations may be disrupted earlier due to pregnancy, for example. So there's no recognition of the different circumstances that may be facing young men and young women and what that might mean for the sorts of interventions that you have. They just talk generally of youth.
It's very interesting indeed, because the majority of the voting population being female, you would have thought this is a great market to put your manifesto out to. Why is it, do you think, that they've missed out on this big opportunity?
I don't think women necessarily vote as a constituency. In some parts of the world, if you take the US elections right now, you can see where the women's vote is going and who it favours and who it doesn't. We don't seem to have quite the same pattern here. So I think that's that certainly is one of the challenges. I also think that our thinking, and we held a round table with political parties and organisations earlier this week, our grasp of gender tends to be very shallow. It seems to mean giving women little jobs like chicken farms or having them join co-ops. There's no real thought of how do we shift power within our political system and how uncomfortable it might be to shift power. Giving women little jobs on the side isn't terribly threatening. So I think the approach we take is also doesn't disturb gendered power relations. So I think that's also another contribution. But it also points to a very particular danger we face, is that I think while the focus of the ANC on women has certainly declined, it's not of the same substance and quality as it used to be. Nonetheless, they were the party who did pay the greatest attention to gender. As they lose power and parties come in who don't have a particular focus on gender equality, I think we face a very real challenge. So I think it's actually really important that gender activists and women's organisations start to engage with the opposition in order to expand their thinking around gender.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I'm thinking right now about how manifestos tend to be constructed through patriarchal eyes. If one had to reconstruct a manifesto for the women part of the voting population, what exactly would we expect to see in that?
Well, at this roundtable, some very important suggestions came up. Firstly, many women in the audience wanted a strong commitment on party stances around sex for jobs, sexual harassment and sexual abuse within the parties. They wanted explicit commitments on how that was going to be dealt with, and they wanted manifestos to talk to that. They also talked about the experience of housing and homelessness, how that can be very gendered. And I think we had some women at our roundtable who had been evicted, and they were talking about, for instance, the case of if you have small children, what happens when you are evicted? What do you do with them? I think also women's homelessness tends to be disguised. They live with other family members because living on the streets is quite dangerous. But for those women who do end up on the street, they talk about how in order to get access to some of the housing, you often have to enter into relationships with extremely violent men in order to protect you from the other men. So I think they started to add a dimension to housing and homelessness that we haven't thought about. So they talked, for example, around how transitional housing would be very useful for women once they leave domestic violence shelters to be able to go to, because there is no relationship at this point between shelters and housing. So that was an important suggestion that did come through. There was also suggestions around what do you do about the JMPD? Our Metropolitan Police have the power to intervene in domestic violence, for example. We're not seeing that. We're also seeing how municipal bylaws are being used to harass sex workers, in particular, who are predominantly female. So there were questions around how can you change that? And there were general questions on what can you do about protecting women's safety. It's not just about the police. It's your responsibility to mow the lawns and keep long grass short. It's your responsibility to ensure that transport routes are safe, that there's lighting. but none of those issues around safety are really talked to in the manifestos.
We're running out of time, Lisa, so I just want to ask you a sort of amalgamated question about the three main political parties. We've seen the ANC field a candidate like Togodidiza, a very strong woman in Tshwane, but on the other hand, we have the Marius Fransman debacle. We've seen a very male leadership in the EFF, and their female leaders tend to take a back seat. I was very surprised when they did send a female representative today. Similarly with the DA, we've got a whole lot of powerful men, and I'm struggling to see the female faces behind that. Just give us a sense of how you think political parties are doing in terms of gender equity.
Well, I think the DA and the EFF are not focusing and paying the attention they should, which is a problem given their growth in numbers. I mean, I think the ANC has a very mixed record. You can see somebody like Togodidiza, but as you say, you can see Marius Fransman. You can also see, and he's been completely overlooked, a man named George Mtimunye, who harassed one of his admin clerks in the municipal council for 3 years. That council was ordered to pay her 1.2 million rand. He is now a senior manager in the Mpumalanga provincial legislature. So I think the ANC gives such an inconsistent message that you can't really take it seriously. What they give on the one hand, they take away on the other. So I think it's why we're at this dangerous point where if we don't take strong action as gender activists, we're going to see the shallow gains we've made eroded even further and pure lip service take over.
Thank you very much for talking to us, Lisa. Excellent to have your insight into that story. It was an aspect that hasn't been widely discussed during these elections. Gender rights activist Lisa Vetten talking to us about gender and the importance of tackling those issues as we near this election.